Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled Kansas City and American Crossroads. Our leader for this session is Diane Mutti Burke, Professor of History, Co-Director of the Center for Digital and Public Humanities at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. We're also joined by two talented members of our Teacher Advisory Council and Matt Hicks, who will be assisting us throughout this evening. So thank you both for joining us. As always, we sincerely and wholeheartedly appreciate you. Diane Mutti Burke is a historian of the American South and Civil War with a particular interest in the history of slavery, women, and the Missouri-Kansas border region. She teaches a range of courses on 19th century American history, including courses on the Civil War, the American South, the history of U.S. women to 1877, the Missouri-Kansas border wars, and the Civil War in film and memory. In addition, she co-directs a summer study abroad program in Ireland. Dr. Mutti Burke is a native Kansas Citian who earned her BA from Dartmouth College and MA and PhD from Emory University. She has focused much of her research on the history of Missouri. Her award-winning first book on slavery's border, Missouri's Small Slaveholding Households, 1815 to 1865, is an examination of how slavery and slaveholding were influenced by both the geography and the smaller scale of slavery in the state. She has written a number of articles about slavery, women, and the Civil War in Missouri. In addition, she has co-edited 3 collections of scholarly articles on Kansas City and the Missouri-Kansas border region, Kansas City American Crossroads, co-edited with John Herron, and Bleeding Kansas, Bleeding Missouri, The Long Civil War on the Border, co-edited with Jonathan Earl, and Wide Open Town, Kansas City during the Pendergast era, co-edited with John Herron and Jason Rowe. The articles in the Bleeding Kansas, Bleeding Missouri, and Wide Open Town collection were the product of major public conferences at the Kansas City Public Library. Dr. Mutti Burke is currently researching a book project that explores the experiences of civilian refugees from throughout the Confederacy and border states during the Civil War. She also is completing an edited and annotated diary of a Missouri woman named Paulina Straighten. Dr. Mutti Burke is deeply engaged in bringing the history of this region to the public through her roles as director of UMKC's Center for Midwestern Studies and co-director of UMKC's Center for Digital and Public Humanities. To all of our teachers who are here tonight, and without further ado, I present to you our speaker and friend of the National Humanities Center, Dr. Diane Mutti Burke. Dr. Mutti Burke, we appreciate you. We appreciate you being here, and we are looking forward to your talk. Hope you are well.
I am well, and thanks for the introduction, Mike. And thanks to Elizabeth and Matt for helping to facilitate the questions today. All right, I guess I will go ahead and get started. So as Mike told you, I grew up in Kansas City, and as a historian, I focused my career on researching, writing, and teaching about this region. So I'm sure it's not surprising to you that I believe Kansas City and its greater region is historically significant. But many of you who are not from Kansas City may actually question this claim. So before we explore the history, I'd like to say a few words about my own teaching experiences, as well as my thoughts on the significance of place. And I want to apologize. It is allergy season here, and so hopefully I will not have to cough over the course of the talk. So my first book, which focuses on the experiences of enslaved people and enslavers in rural Missouri, was the result of my personal interest in the history of my home state. I actually started this work as an undergraduate student and continued it into graduate school. And looking back on this experience, I think I began this project in order to better understand the place where I'd spent the first 18 years of my life. Now, at the time, I'm not sure I fully recognized why I felt compelled to pursue this topic. But once I started teaching students in Kansas City, I began to better understand the power of place. And this was because my students were deeply interested in learning about the history of their home region. I kept bringing in content from my own work, and they seemed very, very interested in it and found it very compelling. So this realization led me to focus more of my class content on regional history, as well as to begin to engage in collaborative projects with local cultural organizations and to give public talks to really anybody who would ask me to come. And I'm sure many of you have recognized similar interest in the local at your school and in your community. And if you haven't done this kind of work before, I really strongly encourage you to make connections with local history, even if your primary mandate is to teach the larger national stories. I know that that's what most of you need to focus on, but peppering in some of this local history, I think, will reap really rich rewards for you and your students. Now, I'd now like to pivot to how the history of Kansas City is connected to the larger story. Sometimes a specific location has unique significance in the broader sense, or is representative of a larger story. And I think both is true for Kansas City and the greater region. Kansas City was at the crossroads of the nation in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It was located at the nexus of transportation networks, and the region played a central role in white Americans' movement westward and the national conflict over the expansion of slavery. And as the city grew in the decades after the Civil War, Kansas City developed into a microcosm of the nation, reflecting the larger cultural and historical forces that shaped the era in U.S. history. City leaders boasted of KC's economic and civic triumphs, and culture flourished. Yet these achievements occurred in a political, social, and economic landscape that was fraught with machine politics, vice, racial inequalities, and residents' enduring fight for their rights and their freedoms. In the years after World War II, Kansas City was representative of the many ills that plagued urban America. It's only recently that the city has pulled out of this long period of decline. So this is the history that I plan to share with you today. I think it was indicated that I'm going to start post-Civil War, but I'm actually going to start earlier than that because I think it's important. So hopefully you will learn something new about Kansas City, as well as will come around to my idea that the city is significant to the larger American story. But even more important, I hope that I will provoke you to think about ways that your community might serve as a window into understanding American history. Okay, I am trying to forward the slides, and I am not successful at doing that. Okay, there we go. I'll do it a different way. All right. So first, I want to start with a short story. In May of 1968, Vice President Hubert H. Humphrey arrived in St. Louis, on the other side of the state, to dedicate what would become Missouri's most famous landmark, the Gateway Arch. Now it's working. So I'm going to move down here. Designed by Finnish architect Eero Saarinen, and I'm sorry if I butchered that, the soaring steel arch rises more than 600 feet above its foundation on the bank of the Mississippi River. The outline of the arch, immortalized on postage stamps and commemorative state quarters, is ubiquitous within Missouri. The landmark was built to celebrate the contribution of St. Louis to the development of the American West. In linking the arch to the opening of the West, its architects incorporated America's tallest monument into a powerful national mythology. From Thomas Jefferson forward, generations of American citizens had long dreamed of an expansive empire of liberty and democracy that was anchored in the lands of the West. Now, Jefferson was a product of the Atlantic world, but he would never venture more than a few dozen miles west of his Virginia home. But of the West, he remained a man obsessed. In his travels, he scoured libraries and personal estates, eventually amassing one of the largest private collections about the peoples and the geography of the American West. And it was his faith in the Western promise that prompted his sponsorship of Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, and the rest of the Corps of Discovery. An ambitious venture to explore America's newest acquisition, the Louisiana Purchase. Lewis and Clark were meant to be agents of national greatness as much as they were explorers. They mapped and cataloged the bounty of the region, but they also hoped to lay claim to a territory that Jefferson and many like him believed would fulfill the destiny of the young United States. And within this weighty mythology, St. Louis stood at the heart of it all, the jumping-off point for settlers, swindlers, and dreamers who looked to the West as the future of the Republic. But greeting Humphrey on this May Day was not a multitude of flag-waving Jeffersonians, but a very heavy rain. So much rain that the event organizers canceled a planned regatta and gathered crowds remained smaller than expected. But the rain did not dampen Humphrey's enthusiasm. As in the middle of his presidential campaign, he tied himself and the nation to the promise and potential embodied by the arch. Quote, "Let the Gateway Arch stand," Humphrey declared, "as a symbol of America's determination to have beauty with utility, quality with quantity, and humanity with progress," he said. And as soggy St. Louis residents applauded, in Kansas City, 250 miles to the west, Humphrey's visit to the arch met with a resounding thud. The Kansas City Star, the city's main newspaper, devoted only a few lines to the vice president's speech, and that within a larger story about a local convention of dairymen. One can look to a busy political calendar to explain this lukewarm reception. Fighting for headline space in Kansas City newspapers were European capitals aflame with student protests, an escalating war in Vietnam, and an intense presidential race. But perhaps one should view the reaction to Humphrey's speech in a more straightforward regional term. As the celebratory opening of the Gateway Arch, the silence of Kansas City residents confirmed what they believed, and I think the history of the region might suggest the arch was misplaced. I'm sure anybody listening from St. Louis will not like to hear this. In the battle for statewide supremacy, St. Louis had the advantage of geography, timing, and opportunity. Located at the confluence of two major waterways and settled by international merchants with connections to worldwide markets, St. Louis was a city almost from its inception. Kansas City, by contrast, sat on the margins, and in fact, at this point, it didn't even exist. St. Louis in 1820 claimed nearly 4,000 residents. The area which eventually became Kansas City had only a handful of settlers. St. Louis was a commercial center looking east to the markets of the East Coast and the Atlantic world. The future Kansas City was a collection of outposts and cabins struggling to establish trading relationships with local indigenous people. Even more significantly, the same mythology giving St. Louis pride of place within the American narrative conveniently placed Kansas City on the edge of what was then considered a largely hostile and uninhabitable so-called Great American Desert. Explorers like Zebulon Pike and Stephen Long spoke with federal authority when they repeated the mistaken claim that there was little of value to the American empire in the lands of the Great Plains. Even William Clark, who, unlike many of his early 19th century contemporaries, recognized the potential of the region that would become Kansas City, still bemoaned its separation from the rest of what he called the civilized world. Much later, others in literature, high culture, and business also emphasized Kansas City's position within what we would call now the Great Flyover Zone. The staying power of these perceptions is remarkable. Despite census numbers pushing Kansas City past St. Louis in size and population, and this is the city proper, contemporary opinion among some, and especially folks from St. Louis, still consider St. Louis urbane and urban, and Kansas City maybe a little rustic and provincial. But a closer examination of the history of Kansas City reveals a much more complicated story. Not only should Kansas City be granted a larger space within the national story, but with respect to St. Louis and its most celebrated monument, Kansas City remains the true gateway to the West and the crossroads of the nation. Although rarely the history that survives in the popular imagination, few places in the region can claim as interesting and significant history as Kansas City. The explorers who moved through the region in the first decades of the 19th century may not have immediately recognized the ingredients needed to build a successful community in Kansas City, but they would be among the last to miss the signs. And actually, I'm going to go back to the slide of Daniel Boone coming through the Cumberland Gap into, ultimately, he's going to go from Kentucky into Missouri. From its beginnings as a fur trading outpost in the 1820s, established by French traders out of St. Louis, the community was marked by its fortuitous location and the distinctive rolling energy of a Western frontier community. French trappers, American businessmen such as John Sutter, who was soon to start a frenzied rush to the California goldfields, and indigenous people created a small but vibrant multi-ethnic enclave on the banks of the Missouri River near the juncture of the Kansas or Kaw River, so where Kansas City is located today. At the conclusion of the War of 1812, and after the status of slavery was secured by the Compromise of 1820, white settlers began moving in large numbers from their original eastern homes to the inexpensive and fertile lands along the Missouri River in central and western Missouri, a region that after the Civil War became known as Little Dixie. Farmers, attracted by the fertile soils of the Missouri Valley, moved into the region, laying the foundation for a heartland agricultural empire. These intrepid migrants ventured westward, hoping to improve their economic and social circumstances in the new state. Most of the newcomers came from the upper South states of Kentucky, Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, and many of them brought enslaved people with them. As they pushed farther westward, the federal government supported their land acquisition goals by negotiating treaties and using threats of violence, of course, to force Missouri's indigenous residents into the area west of Missouri, so now Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. The long dominant Osage, who had forged an alliance with French and later American trappers and traders, were forced out of the region soon after the U.S., quote, purchased what is now Missouri from the French. So they had systematically pushed most Native Americans out of Missouri by the mid-1830s. All of these newcomers ultimately led Missourians to demand statehood. This episode placed Missouri at the center of a major event in the lead up to the Civil War. Missourians' desire to enter as a slave state resulted in a major national political crisis, which was finally resolved when the U.S. Congress decided to forge the so-called Missouri Compromise in 1820, through which Missouri entered the Union as a slave state and Maine entered as a free state the year later. This compromise also drew a line westward from Missouri's southern border, creating a boundary between slave and free states for future states who entered after that date. So you can see this line on the map. Jefferson observed at the time that this decision would not resolve the underlying issue of slavery and its expansion, and indeed, according to him, was, quote, a fire bell in the night. By the early 1820s, Americans had pushed as far west as the current location of Kansas City. The Missouri State Legislature established Jackson County, the home county of the eventual city of Kansas City, on December 15, 1826. The county was named after then U.S. Senator and War of 1812 hero from Tennessee, Andrew Jackson. For the first 3 decades after statehood, there was no city of Kansas City. The town of Westport came first. Founded in 1833 and situated on the high bluffs a distance away from the south bank of the Missouri River, Westport served as a riverport town, a trading post, and the eventual outfitting spot for people traveling west over the overland trails. The American newcomers to western Missouri utilized the labor of both family members and enslaved workers to quickly establish farms, homes, businesses, and towns in the new land. Most were farmers who grew crops and raised livestock for household use, as well as sale in the marketplace. So from the very beginning of settlement, Western Missourians were connected to national and international markets by the Missouri, Ohio, and Mississippi river systems. The river trade allowed them to both transport their agricultural products to distant markets and to purchase the increasing variety of manufactured goods and merchandise shipped westward via steamboat. So Missourians very quickly established towns and institutions such as churches, businesses, and schools. And so this, so-called frontier period sort of passes quickly. Slavery played a central role in the economy, society, and politics of Western Missouri in the decades before the Civil War. By 1860, 17% of Jackson County's population was enslaved, making it among the 10 Missouri counties with the largest enslaved populations. Most white Missourians considered slavery essential to the economic development of the region, and those who had the financial means preferred to employ enslaved workers in their homes, farms, and businesses. So most Missouri farmers were engaging in diversified agriculture. They prioritized cultivating grain crops, such as corn and oats, planting gardens and orchards. They raised livestock and poultry for the use of those who were residing in their households. But to increase their assets and purchasing power, they also cultivated tobacco and hemp, which was primarily used to make rope or bagging for southern cotton crops, as well as they raised hogs, cattle, horses, oxen, and mules for sale in both local and distant markets. They're very much tied to southern markets at this point. Western Missouri entrepreneurs eventually established light manufacturing facilities to process tobacco, hemp, and hogs before shipping them out of state. So as I suggested earlier, enslavement in Missouri was practiced on a much smaller scale than in the plantation. This was primarily because diversified agriculture required fewer workers than large-scale monocultures such as cotton or sugarcane. So fewer workers, enslaved workers, meant less need for overseers to manage farming operations. So what this meant was that Missouri enslavers and their family members typically managed the few enslaved workers on their property and oftentimes labored alongside them in their homes and fields. Now, to be clear, enslaved people are performing the most difficult and physically demanding tasks. Most enslaved Missourians worked as general farmhands and domestic servants, although a few labored in local businesses or manufacturing operations or learned trades such as brickmaking, carpentry, and blacksmithing. The smaller scale of most slavery units in Western Missouri profoundly influenced the everyday lives of enslaved people. There were typically few enslaved people on any given property. So most units were comprised of 1 or 2 adults and numerous children. So these demographics made it really challenging for enslaved Missourians to find romantic partners on their home farms or regularly socialize with other enslaved people. But even though they faced all of these difficulties, most people, worked really hard to try to forge families and friendships within their greater neighborhoods. And I should mention that the intimacy of these small-scale slaveholding households often led to really, to gross abuse by enslavers against enslaved people, because they were living and working together so closely each day. So although agriculture and slavery were central to the economics of the region, Western Missourians also capitalized on the area's locations at the crossroads of the nation. The population of Western Missouri counties remained small in the first half of the 19th century, but Western Missourians financially benefited both from their geographic location on the Missouri River, with its national and international trade connections, and their location on the western edge of U.S. settlement. So given their location, Western Missourians increasingly focused their attention on the West. Missourians first created overland trade routes with New Mexico on the Santa Fe Trail, but over time, tens and thousands of settlers poured through the region on their way to all points west. In Independence, Westport, and other satellite communities of the present-day Kansas City, first caravans to New Mexico and later settlers heading to Oregon and California, and eventually Colorado and Nevada, bought supplies and readied for their transcontinental trek. Few other cities, including St. Louis, bore witness to such a steady stream of movement and migration in the 19th century. In the early decades of the century, it was as Jefferson had envisioned. The Kansas City area became the portal to the nation's future. Now, there's one other interesting story that I want to tell you about this early settlement, and that is that in the early 1830s, members of the Church of Latter-day Saints also saw the promise of this new land, and they arrived to build a model community, a western version of the city on a hill, in Jackson County. After Joseph Smith declared that he had received a revelation that Jackson County was the God-given site of the Mormon city of Zion, a large number of church members moved to the location. So by 1833, these Mormon newcomers comprised nearly a third of the residents of Jackson County. So this is only about a decade after it was established. And as a foreshadowing of future trouble, Jackson County residents with roots in the Upper South deeply resented the growing influence of the Mormon residents. Western Missourians grew increasingly agitated as Mormons purchased more and more land, believing that their growing economic power would threaten the original settlers' political and social dominance. But their greatest fears stemmed from concerns that the Mormons, who they believed would negatively influence the enslaved population and incite indigenous nations over the state line in what was then Indian Territory, but what's now Kansas. So what ended up happening in July of 1833 is that 400 to 500 male citizens of Jackson County met. They wrote a resolution that encouraged their Mormon neighbors to voluntarily remove, although there was this underlying threat that they would attack them if they refused. They pointed to all these different outrages, the ones that I mentioned, but one of the things that concerned them the most was that the lot of invited free Black brethren to join them in Zion, and this was kind of the final straw, the biggest offense in the mind of the Missourians, because they thought that the Mormons' free Black associates would be, quote, a corrupting influence on our slaves, they said. And so what they ultimately did was they forced them out of Jackson County, north of the river, into Clay and Ray counties, where they stayed for a couple of years. But eventually, the people of Clay and Ray did not want them there either. And what ended up happening was the Missouri State Legislature, in this sort of spirit of compromise, voted in 1836 to carve out a new county that they called Caldwell in northwest Missouri. And it was going to be a reservation of sorts for Mormon residents. So they sent them there. But then over time, they started spilling out across the county lines into adjoining counties, and it agitated the Missourians again. So ultimately, Western Missourians demanded action, and Missouri Governor and Jackson County resident Lilburn Boggs, who had experienced the previous eviction of Mormons, gladly obliged by proclaiming, quote, Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. Their outrages are beyond all descriptions, he wrote. And so he called up the militia to evict, essentially, what he called Mormon intruders. And they thought, the Missourians, many Missourians, although not everybody agreed with this at the time, that evicting the Mormons would restore law and order in western Missouri and secure their small slaveholding promised land for people like themselves. Okay, so this is, kind of the decades in the early development of western Missouri, but then the region starts to play an outsized role, honestly, in the lead up to the Civil War. So maybe this would be a time for a break if there are any questions that people have.
Good deal. Thank you so much. I'll encourage you all, if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A chat. I see that the conversation in the audience chat is moving along. Thank you all for contributing. We have a question from Joe. Joe's question is, do primary sources reveal if any specific Christian denominations in Missouri were active in anti-slavery and abolitionist movements? Some more than others? Question mark.
Yes, that would be true. Yes, there were some, and what ends up happening in the years before the Civil War, and certainly during the Civil War itself, that just like denominations, the Protestant denominations splintered between the North and the South, they started to splinter in Missouri as well. So there were, Methodist North and Methodist South folks. There, the Presbyterian Church splintered apart, as did the Baptists. There is some anti-slavery activity in Missouri. There's certainly some abolitionism. Most of it is in the eastern part of the state around St. Louis, and it is in large measure because of an influx of a lot of German immigrants who tended to be anti-slavery. Although there starts to be quite a few Northerners that move into the state as well in the decades before the Civil War. So there were some folks who do have anti-slavery sentiments. Whether or not they're active abolitionists, some were, and most famously, there was a man named Elijah Lovejoy who was a martyr for the abolitionist cause. He had an anti-slavery press in St. Louis, and he had to move it over to Illinois, and they came and attacked it, and he was killed in the process of defending his press. So there were some, but I think most Missourians were, if not actively involved in slavery, most of them at least tacitly supported it, with the exception of some of these folks that I mentioned. And there seemed to be more support for it in Western Missouri for the reasons I'm going to talk about here coming up.
Good deal. Thank you. Another question that you touched on earlier. How did the close proximity to the free territory of Kansas impact the lives of enslaved people in Kansas City? Were there significant documented instances of escape attempts operating in or around that area, or even the influence of the Underground Railroad?
There sure were, especially as the Civil War approached. So during the Bleeding Kansas period, and then there was much more activity as during the Civil War itself, because enslaved people were very politically astute. They were paying attention to what was going on around them. They were listening for evidence of how the Bleeding Kansas episode and the Civil War would impact them, and there were some folks who could read, and so they would share newspapers and other materials they got their hands on with other people in their community. So you start to see a lot of people escaping into Kansas, but there's no guarantee once you get there that you're safe. I mean, you have to find somebody who will help you, and then it's really then that they connected into an underground railroad network, which was spiriting some people away up through Nebraska and Iowa over into Illinois and the Great Lakes. But you had to get out of Missouri first. There were some raids into Missouri by abolitionists like John Brown, famously, but mostly it's the activities and the bravery of enslaved people themselves to get themselves out of the state. And what I can tell you from my own research and that of a friend is that there was quite a bit of a geographic mobility of enslaved people in Missouri because of the small-scale slavery and the fact that enslavers needed enslaved people to move around to do the work of the farm and also to visit their partners who oftentimes lived on other properties. And so people knew the lay of the land, and they used all of that knowledge and put it into play when the opportunity arose for them to escape.
Good deal. Thank you so very much. Again, if there should be any additional questions, please drop them in the Q&A chat. We're going to move ahead. Thank you so much.
All right. So I'm going to move into Bleeding Kansas and the Civil War. So I told you the story about the Mormon eviction because I think this violence, this tendency toward violence and evicting people who don't agree with you, that really colored the early days of the Kansas City region. So, of course, they evicted indigenous people, and then they evicted Mormons. this really set the stage for what was to come. So I already mentioned that after the 1830s, the population of Missouri became increasingly diverse as German immigrants and migrants from northern states began to challenge the dominance of what had really been a southern majority and an upper south majority, really, for the first few decades of settlement. So these new settlers arrived with a different vision for the state's future. Time and again, Western Missourians found themselves on the front lines of defending the society that they had created on the borders of slavery. In the 1850s and 60s, the area was swept into the bitter sectionalism of the era. So long before the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, the eyes of the nation were on the citizens of Western Missouri and eastern Kansas. They attempted to resolve the question of slavery and its place in the Republic. And really, I mean, this is not an exaggeration to say this. Everybody was paying attention to what was happening out here along the western border. Political debates degenerated into bitter feuds that in turn became open hostilities along the Missouri-Kansas border. So in 1854, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this story, when the northern part of what was then called Indian Country was open to white settlement through the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Free soil settlers from the Northeast, many who were financed by anti-slavery interests, flooded into the region in an attempt to ensure that Kansas would enter the Union as a free state. And in turn, residents of Western Missouri moved over the state line to stake claim to the land as well. The town and eventual city of Kansas, it was not called Kansas City yet, was established during this tumultuous period. So they built this town north of Westport along the south bank of the Missouri River, and the idea was, by these business leaders, was to capitalize on all these increased number of people that were going to come through the city. So they would disembark at Kansas City or the city of Kansas, they would buy their stuff, and then they would move into Kansas. And of course, people continue to trek westward as well. While in Western Missouri, they believed that all these newcomers, some believed the newcomers would spur economic development, there were a lot of others who really saw the folks who were coming, especially those from the Northeast, as a direct threat to their society and especially to slavery. Many believed that if they didn't take matters into their own hands, then enslaved people would, as one man said, quote, become valueless in Missouri, because they were concerned that they were going to run across the border into Kansas. In addition to some laying claim to the land, many others rode into Kansas on election days to vote the pro-slavery ticket. The situation along the Missouri-Kansas border quickly deteriorated as pro-slavery and free soil defenders started to demonize their enemies. Western Missourians really believed that it was an existential threat, and they began raiding into Kansas in an effort to intimidate free soil settlers. So this is the sitting senator from the state of Missouri. He's from Western Missouri. He wrote a letter to fellow pro-slavery sympathizer, U.S. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, and he drew parallels to earlier purges. So he bragged, quote, "We will be compelled to shoot, burn, and hang, but the thing will be over soon. We intend to, quote, Mormonize the abolitionists," is what he said. Atchison's statement starkly reveals the objectives and strategies that the Western Missourians had so long employed. So evicting those who they believed threatened their communities through a campaign of intimidation and violence had proved highly effective in the case of the Latter-day Saints. Now, what they did not anticipate was that this time the folks, not that the Mormons weren't motivated, of course they were, to protect their own property, but the folks that were coming from the Northeast were financed by Northern anti-slavery interests and ultimately were armed by them. And so what ends up happening is that the situation very, very quickly spins out of control. And ultimately, there are these organized guerrilla bands led by free soilers such as James Montgomery, Charles Doc Jennison, and most famously John Brown. They began raiding the farms of pro-slavery Kansas and crossing over the state line to liberate Missourians' property, including enslaved people. And it is no exaggeration to say that Americans' attention, as I mentioned, was on this region in the years leading up to the Civil War. So really the series of events that happened in this Missouri-Kansas border region were central to the larger story leading up to the Civil War. The Missouri Compromise, and then the Dred Scott decision, which came out of St. Louis, Bleeding Kansas, John Brown's growing fame, and he was made famous by his exploits in Kansas, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which focused on what was happening in Kansas. All of these were crucial to the larger national story. Indeed, some would argue, including me, that the Civil War really starts, at least the fighting part of it starts on Missouri's western border. This was the place where Americans first fought with each other over their vision for the future of the nation. So was it to be a nation with slavery or without it? And all of this laid the groundwork for even greater violence during the Civil War itself. Missouri was a border state during the American Civil War, and although the men of Missouri elected delegates to Missouri State's Constitutional Convention in early 1861 and charged them with voting to remain in the Union, there were a significant number of people who supported secession, and a lot of them were actually out here in western Missouri. So white Missourians were politically divided throughout the war, with men fighting for both sides in the conventional armies. But the conventional warfare in Missouri was by and large over by early 1862. So other than a couple of dramatic raids by the Confederate Army out of Arkansas into the state, what was left was a Union military occupation because the Union Army wanted to protect the railroads and the rivers, and a guerrilla insurgency that emerged to counter it. So this is, and I forgot to forward my slides. So this is Jennison. He's a Jayhawker, and any of you who know anything about the University of Kansas, they're the Jayhawks. This is where this name comes from. He was a guerrilla during Bleeding Kansas days, but then he and his men just sort of roll into the Union Army, but they continue some of their same tactics. But then there are some other guys you may know, including Frank and Jesse James, who were pro-Confederate guerrillas. And so what ends up happening is that the Union forces and the guerrillas are fighting off and on throughout western Missouri, where the conflict is the most extreme. The Confederates say that would have said that they were protecting their families and their farms, and I should add, even though they didn't say this very often, enslaved property, enslaved people, because that they were members of their household. They largely came from the enslaving class. But really, the people of the region are the ones who suffer the most, because whichever side they're on, they're being hit by one side or the other. Their property is destroyed, it's stolen, and a number of people flee their homes because they're too afraid to remain. Now, in comparison, the city of Kansas fared fairly well during the war because Unionist business leaders, because there were some northeastern types and eastern types who had moved into the city to take advantage of this Kansas territory opening up, they called in the Union Army from Fort Leavenworth into the city in order to protect their business interests. But of course, a lot of people are not pleased with this at all. And there are these roaming bands of guerrillas who are just wreaking havoc in western Missouri. They're led by leaders such as William Quantrell and Bloody Bill Anderson, but they include the James and Younger brothers, who go on to post-war banditry fame. So what ends up happening is that they create a new district, a military district called the District of the Border. They put this Kansas resident, Thomas Ewing Jr., in charge. And he knows that these guerrillas are really supported by households, by women and children and elderly people, by their own kin and friends. And so he starts to go after those folks He ends up arresting a number of women and jailing them in a makeshift jail in downtown Kansas City, what's now downtown Kansas City. The building collapses and it kills 4 women. And historians think it's because the soldiers may have moved a load-bearing wall, but of course, there's all sorts of conspiracy theories that are flying around that this was a purposeful thing. One of the women who was killed is Bill Anderson's sister. So what ends up happening is about a week later, about 400 guerrillas ride into Lawrence, Kansas, and they kill 180 unarmed men and boys, and they burn down the town. And in response to this, General Ewing, he decides that he needs to try to stop a cross-border raid, and he needs to essentially punish the people of the region for the guerrillas' activity. And I think his strategy is that he thinks if he gets rid of the women and the children, then the guerrillas will lose their supply lines and they'll leave the region. And so he ends up issuing what's called General Order Number 11, which is to evict the entire civilian population, whether you support the Union or the Confederacy, in the shaded counties that you see on this map. So Jackson County, the county, and the 2.5 counties or 2 1/3 counties south of it. There were 40,000 people in these counties in 1860. Historians estimate that about 20,000 probably were evicted by this order, which tells you that 20,000 other people had left ahead of this order, which I think suggests how horrible of a place it was to be during the war. Now, this is, it's a really, epic story, honestly, of how things fell apart in this region, how civilians and these armed military forces were acting in such, inhumane ways as they demonized one another and dehumanized one another. It's really, honestly, a cautionary tale. Now, on a more positive note, enslaved people quickly recognized the political and military chaos of the war presented them with opportunities. And I've already talked a little bit about this in the question about whether people were escaping into Kansas. So indeed they were. They understood that there might be friendly people in Kansas who might help them. They were also running to Union military encampments, hoping that the Union Army, the soldiers in these encampments, would help them. And it's kind of shifting sands as to whether or not they do based on military policy, but by about midway through the war, they mostly were helping people in some capacity as they came into these Union military encampments. And I want to point out that because Missouri is a border state and there are, in fact, Unionist and Confederate enslavers in the state, it is excluded from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of January 1863 because of its status. But by this point, by midway through the war, and certainly in the 2 years that follow, slavery is really disintegrating on the ground. And so even though it is not officially over, and certainly there are still enslaved people in place on their enslavers' property, it is severely undermined. And so on January 11th, 1865, the then Republican-dominated Missouri State Constitutional Convention, they end up passing an emancipation ordinance ahead of the 13th Amendment. So that's kind of an interesting part of the story. So the type of warfare, I think, that took place on the Missouri-Kansas border was really a precursor of what enveloped the southern states during the last years of the Civil War. This was hard war. And in fact, I think you could make an argument that Union troops, including guys like Grant and Sherman, were here in Missouri in the first year of the war, and it was really kind of a proving ground for the direction that the war took in the East in the last hard years. So it's a really, really interesting story. Again, there was not much actual official Union or Confederate warfare that took place, except there was one significant raid by General Sterling Price and his Confederate force into Missouri in the late summer and early fall of 1864, which resulted in the largest conventional battle fought west of the Mississippi River. It was the Battle of Westport, so just to the south of Kansas City. Okay, so enough of this early history. Now we'll get to the microcosm part. So any other questions about the Civil War at this point?
We do. Question from Andrew. What role might Lincoln's Attorney General Edward Bates have played in these events leading up to the Civil War?
Oh, that's a good question. So, he's obviously in his cabinet during the war, and he has connections in Missouri, and it does seem that there was a bit of a pipeline directly to Lincoln from folks here in Missouri. I think a lot of it was flowing through Bates, and I think mostly through Bates. So it's that's a good question. I don't know if I can fully answer it, but I do know that Lincoln was certainly aware of what was happening out here, and through all these written communication that was coming from Missourians, but also through these back channels, and he is he's being very careful, both with Missouri and Kentucky, to make sure that he doesn't alienate, especially Unionists and slavers. And again, there were, it's surprising, but there were a lot of them. And so he does not want to alienate these folks and cause them to officially secede. Although the duly elected government of Missouri does officially secede. But I think, most historians, the people of the state did not vote to secede. So it's a complicated story.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Another question. You mentioned that the Civil War, the initial fighting and battles began in Missouri. Why does it seem that Missouri's complex and significant involvement in the Civil War, including internal divisions, strategic importance, why does it often receive less attention in classroom settings than the roles of other states? And I say this as someone who, is here in North Carolina, and, lived throughout the Southeast. But can you speak to that?
That is $1 million question. That has been the case in a frustrating way. Now, the flip side of that is it leaves it kind of wide open for people to research it. And in fact, they have in the last 15 years. There are a number of award-winning books that folks have written about the war in the West and the Trans-Mississippi West. So it is super significant, although there aren't major battles other than this Battle of Westport. So I think that that's why one of the main reasons it has not gotten the attention of Civil War historians. But what I will tell you is that this guerrilla warfare angle has increasingly drawn people's attention. And I think it's really because of our more contemporary wars. It obviously has significance trying to understand what went wrong here with the Union military occupation, because it did go very poorly. And I don't, I've thought a lot about this, trying to figure out what they could have done differently, but what they did not, in the words of the more recent past, win the hearts and minds of the people. So it's a story that has a lot of significance, and I think warrants future study, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this refugee project, because that is also a story that has not received as much attention as it had or as it should. And Missouri, it's a humanitarian crisis in this state. So it's I started there and moved outward to other parts of the South.
Good deal. Well, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you. And so all the question we have for now, again, everyone, we'll save some time at the end for any additional questions that you would have, but we're okay to move along. Thank you.
All right, great. Yes, I need to start moving a little more quickly, it appears. Okay, so in the end, Kansas City, like much of the region, was really saved by the railroad. Kansas City's pro-union business leaders made the difference in the city's trajectory after the war. So because they were unionists, they were able to get investment to flow into the city, unlike some other cities in the region, like St. Joe. And so they were able to get this bridge across the Missouri River that connected to a railroad line, connected railroad lines north and south of the river. Kansas City was a good spot for this because you could take a railroad south without having to cross over the Kansas River. So it ended up geographically being a really important place for the railroad. So they started construction in 1867. It lasted for another 2 years. And really, this bridge is what makes Kansas City. So by 1870, there are 7 major railroads that are flowing through Kansas City. Many more are about to arrive. And the rail lines brought access to markets, and the city became a leading grain and livestock production hub for the city. But they brought more than money. The railroad connections tied Kansas City and its hinterlands to its hinterlands, and in the process helped to forge a common regional sensibility based on a progressive faith in agricultural development as the region's farmers converted to corn and livestock production, and their products were shipped throughout the nation and abroad. A major outcome was the development of the Kansas City stockyards, which were only second to Chicago in the volume of livestock shipped into the city, processed, and shipped out in the period between 1870 and 1950. The key to the city's success was the close proximity to the livestock producing areas to the west and to the volume of railroad lines. So eventually, Kansas City had more railroad lines coming through and connecting in the city than anywhere in the nation, save Chicago. So you can see Chicago's the winner and all these things. As the largest metropolitan area nearest the geographic center of the lower U.S. states, this made sense. The city celebrated this transportation dominance by building and later expanding a grand railroad station in the West Bottoms, adjacent to the Missouri and Kansas rivers, and the stockyards. And at the end of the Civil War, but they ended up moving the station to higher ground in 1914 after multiple floods, and this is the Union Station that still stands today. Now, not everybody benefits from this, including the James and Younger brothers. There are a lot of people in Missouri who are not happy with, what these signs of progress, which they really see as connected to the Union. Railroad and banking interests. And so it's no accident that these are the things that they attack in their banditry. So these guys are nationally known in the 10 or 15 years after the Civil War, all of the robbing that they're doing in the region. And the state gets the moniker of being the bandit state because of all of this. But at the crossroads of American transportation networks and I think cultural norms, in a lot of ways, Kansas City typified broad trends in American history during these years. The last decades of the 19th and early decades of the 20th century were marked by intense political, social, and economic change as the United States reluctantly at times took its place on the world stage while simultaneously struggling with significant challenges at home. So, for example, Black Missourians began to move into the state's urban centers as early as the years of the Civil War because of the violence in the countryside. So that was one reason they moved, but of course they moved in search of educational and employment opportunities. By the turn of the 20th century, Black Southerners also moved into Missouri cities as part of the larger Great Migration. Kansas City also became a magnet for immigrants in the decades after the war. So first, Irish and German immigrants who had been coming since before the Civil War, but then they were followed by immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Finally, Mexicans moved to the area in the first decades of the 20th century, mostly to work for the railroads. But most of these newcomers overwhelmingly came to work in the building trades, stockyards, rail yards, and in these various agricultural processing facilities. Eventually, some worked in the growing garment industry, which emerged in the early 20th century as businesses started to leave the East Coast in search of cheaper factory sites and lower labor costs and mostly non-unionized workers. Now, there is a significant and really interesting story about efforts to unionize the workers in the garment industry in Kansas City, but the reason they came was because they weren't unionized, at least initially. But the region's Crossroads location also connected Kansas City to other places and ideas as well. So unfortunately, one thing that happened is that there began to be growing support for Jim Crow racial segregation. And so it was growing in Missouri. Inequality was growing in Missouri just as it did in the South during the waning decades of the 19th century. And there were many aspects of segregation in Kansas City that were similar to the South. Over time, more affluent white residents began to move out of neighborhoods that had initially housed diverse Kansas Cityans. Eventually, Black residents resided in neighborhoods on the east side of downtown, and Mexican residents lived near the rail yards on the west side. Black and Mexican children were segregated in their own schools, which were under-resourced. They were forced to seek medical care at segregated hospitals. They also were treated as second-class citizens in stores, restaurants, public accommodations, and parks. Yet it is interesting to note that Black men did not lose a vote in Missouri. They never did. This is because they were considered an important voting bloc in both Kansas City and St. Louis, and both political parties were courting their votes. So they tried to disenfranchise Black men at one point, kind of early in the century, but ultimately it is beaten back. So Black men were able to maintain some political influence in the cities through political patronage jobs and successful building projects, such as new schools and hospitals. And even though Kansas City was segregated, there remained some opportunities for individuals to negotiate and some small benefits for the community. Now, in the same years, Kansas City continued to serve as a commercial center for extractive industries. It also attracted, so during these years that was happening, it also attracted the traditional markers of metropolitan America. So first came a professional and progressive city government, and then the outward symbols, including museums, theaters, and opera houses of cultural sophistication. The City Beautiful movement replaced narrow streets with George Kessler-designed wide boulevards, parkways, and fountains, bringing a distinctive aesthetic sensibility to the city that continues to the present. City leaders were aware of Kansas City's rough-around-the-edges reputation, and they strategized about showing the city's best face to the nation. So this period of rapid growth also led to the rise of some of the strongest one of the strongest political machines in the nation. And this is the period of time that a lot of people are really interested in. So for nearly 4 decades in the early 20th century, the Pendergast machine controlled many aspects of the city's political and business life. So equal parts benevolent city father and ruthless mob boss, Tom Pendergast and his brother Jim before him helped transform the city from a 19th century cow town to a modern urban community. In wide open Kansas City, leisure became serious business as the city flouted prohibition restrictions. So this is a time that the city gained the reputation of being the Paris of the Plains. And this was, there was a newspaper editor in Omaha who gave it that name. Now this sounds good today, but 100 years ago, it was not really good because this suggested a lot of debauchery that was happening here in Kansas City. Downtown joints jumped to the distinctive sound of Kansas City jazz, played by greats, many greats, including Count Basie and Charlie Parker. Most of these institutions catered to white audiences, and many of these clubs are either owned or protected by the machine and their gangster associates, and they were located oftentimes on the city's east side, either in or near the segregated Black neighborhoods. So in the end, these clubs were a mixed blessing. They allowed for amazing cultural productivity and employment opportunities for Black Kansas Cityans, but they also were sites of vice and corruption, and they were planted in the middle of their community. Yet during this very same time, Kansas City has established many of the city's institutions and built still existing iconic buildings. So the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, the World War I Memorial, the University of Kansas City, which is now UMKC, a Federal Reserve Bank, and the Municipal Auditorium were founded and built during these years. And some of them were WPA projects, I should mention. Kansas City and the state of Missouri held a prominent place in national politics. Missouri, as one of the most populous states in the early decade of the 20th century, which is hard to believe now, but it was true, became an important bellwether state. It always picked the winner in presidential contests until Obama's election in 2008. And before its inevitable collapse, the Pendergast machine produced one of the most distinctive regional products, Harry S. Truman. He made his political start as judge of the Eastern District of Jackson County. So essentially, he was the county manager for the eastern part of the county. He owed this position and his eventual election as U.S. Senator to the Pendergast machine. This was a fraught relationship for Truman. There's no historical evidence that he was personally corrupt or benefited financially from the machine, but it is clear that he maintained an allegiance to Pendergast throughout his career. So, for example, he was much criticized for coming home for Tom Pendergast's funeral while he was the sitting vice president. In fact, this is just a few months before he becomes president. A few years earlier, Pendergast had served a stint in Fort Leavenworth in the federal prison there for tax evasion. So this is the era that a lot of people describe as the city's golden age. These years were clearly plagued by contradictions. For example, Black Kansas Cityans and a growing number of Mexican immigrants faced racial segregation in the workplaces, businesses, schools, and neighborhoods of the city and the larger region. Yet these same communities carved out vibrant communities with business, cultural organizations, schools, and churches within the 18th and Vine and West Side neighborhoods. For example, the 18th and Vine neighborhood boasted of Lincoln High School, which was a premier public high school for Black students. It had a robust business district. It had a modern hospital for Black patients, like first rate for the time, with really actually quite good equipment initially. And there was a growing class of Black professionals and their families, as well as the Kansas City Call, which was one of the most important Black newspapers in the Midwest. And of course, there was a nationally known baseball team, the Monarchs, who boasted of Jackie Robinson as a teammate. Now, during these same decades, the Kansas City community continued the trend of geographic segregation. In fact, the white citizens of the city perfected racialized residential housing patterns. J.C. Nichols, the developer of the Country Club Plaza and the Brookside neighborhood and a lot of neighborhoods south of there, is celebrated for his forward-thinking residential urban design sensibilities. He built really pleasing neighborhoods with wide streets that sort of wound around, pocket parks, public art, and quaint business districts. Yet he was a leader in the national real estate profession and is best known for pioneering the use of racially restricted covenants to keep people of color out of his neighborhoods. All right, so I realize we're starting to lose time, but run out of time. But does anybody have any questions here? And then I have just a few last things to say about post-World War II.
Good deal. Thank you for that. And we're fine. We're fine on time. Questions from Joe. Did Kansas City see any economic conflict between grain agricultural processing versus livestock? Follow-up question, competing for railroad usage, land for factories, and processing.
Okay. Now that's a good question. My impression is that St. Louis actually emerged as a much bigger grain processing center, and Kansas City was a much bigger meat packing center, although there was some grain processing that happened here as well. But I don't know the answer to that about competing for railroads. There were so many railroads that were coming through here that there would be a lot of opportunity, I would think, to transport your products. But I'm not sure about that. It's a really good question.
No problem, no problem. And Heidi's question is about the St. Louis Arch.
Mhm.
I'm very curious, and I'm hoping you can respond as to why you think the St. Louis Arch was not ideally placed. Was it because of controversy of the buildings that were raised to allow for its construction?
Well,
What's
they did wipe out a lot of riverfront properties to build that thing. That's for sure. I mean, obviously, I'm my little opening bit is a little bit tongue in cheek because St. Louis was important to the opening of the West, but I think it more sort of goes to the one question about like why has this region not gotten as much attention as it deserves, you know, related to the Civil War history. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. And I should say that there's a huge rivalry, I think. Maybe it's just in people's minds really between St. Louis and Kansas City, but I think that Kansas Cityans have always felt like the folks in St. Louis kind of look down their noses at us. So I, you know, so it's a lot of, I think Kansas Cityans, although, as I'll tell you here at the end, there's a lot of pride in the city in recent years, but I think for the longest time, there was kind of an inferiority complex and a lack of identity, like trying to figure out who we are. And I think that broke through in all kinds of ways.
Okay, last question. This is a prohibition question.
Mhm.
Did Kansas City see or experience quote unquote easier access to whether liquor, whiskey, bourbon during Prohibition, particularly that is coming from Kentucky and Tennessee, versus
Yeah.
the more populous East Coast and Mid Atlantic?
Well, I'm not honestly 100% sure where they were sourcing it from, but what I will tell you is that the Pendergast machine had the police force on their payroll essentially, and they were deeply involved in these clubs and this and everything that was associated with them. And so I think that there was just a lot of looking the other way. But it's a really interesting period in that these, there's this sort of like buttoned up, white elite, business elite who are, you know, on the surface running the city, and they're building these cultural institutions at the same time that this other, senior side of the history is playing out. But like Pendergast lives on Ward Parkway, which is one of the grand boulevards where all the rich people live. Like he lives among them. He would have known they all knew each other. And so there's like this symbiotic relationship that emerges between the machine and the elite, the city's business elite, that seems to kind of get things done in a really interesting way. But there's this uh, this there's corruption all around. So it's a really interesting time period. I think people are very fascinated by it.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. We can move ahead. I'm looking forward to creation of Cupcake Land.
Cupcake Land. Okay. All right.
Yeah,
So it's post World
you're
War
okay.
II. Um, Many of the aspects of urban development, including racial tension, crime, unregulated annexation of land, white flight, sprawl, and blight impacted maturing Kansas City. The decline of the manufacturing sector, especially in industries connected to agriculture, such as the stockyards, removed one of the city's main economic engines and contributed to the decline of the established urban core. So the stockyards have moved out. It's not long after World War II that the stockyards move out of Kansas City. They end up moving into more rural areas surrounding Kansas City. So the region is still involved in livestock processing, but not in the city. And there are a lot of reasons for that. It's kind of an environmental disaster down in the West Bottoms. There were constant flooding happened down there, and ultimately, they move out of the city. So in the decades after World War II, Kansas Cityans faced many challenges. some that reflected that they're really reflective of those faced by other cities, and others that were unique to the area. So Black Kansas Cityans were actively involved in civil rights efforts here in Kansas City. Both Black and a few white residents worked together to end segregation in schools, first across the state line in Kansas in the suburban community of Miriam, it's a suburb, and eventually as part of the Brown v. Board, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education Supreme Court case. So there were Kansas Cityans who were involved in that case. Simultaneously, Black Kansas Cityans also agitated to end segregation in public spaces successfully, such as Municipal Auditorium and the Swope Park public swimming pool. So all of this is happening ahead of many of these fights in the South itself. Still, non-white residents continue to be plagued by racial segregation spatially through redlining and blockbusting practices that relegated them to impoverished neighborhoods with little outside investment. So this trend was exacerbated by white flight after schools were ordered to desegregate after Brown. So I'm sure you're aware of how these practices worked, but redlining entailed government-generated housing maps that indicated risk for housing loans and insurance. So this discouraged investment in these neighborhoods and made it difficult for Black families to get loans. And then blockbusting was the process of realtors selling to a Black family and then creating panic among the white neighbors to sell their property before their property values decreased. So all of this led to the flight of white Kansas Cityans to the suburbs in search of higher property values and, quote, good schools, which meant, of course, all white schools. In Kansas City, white residents moved to newly created suburbs in Johnson County on the Kansas side, to eastern and southern Jackson County, and north of the river to Clay and Platte counties. What this meant in practice is that when white residents moved to the suburbs, a stable tax base fueled by property taxes collapsed, leading to disinvestment in downtown, the east and west side neighborhoods, and the Kansas City School District, which of course served the urban core. Many of the white families who remained in the district began sending their children to private and parochial schools. So in a lot of those J.C. Nichols neighborhoods, actually. In addition, in 1951, Kansas City was hit by an epic flood that flooded the river bottom areas and hit them the hardest, destroying the homes of much of the Mexican-American community who lived down in the railroad, near the rail yards, which were down in those bottoms. And then, of course, a story that plays out in many communities, the national interstate system expanded, and it destroyed more neighborhoods in the 1950s through the 1970s. And, and oftentimes these, again, were neighborhoods of Black and brown residents of Kansas City. In 1968, these many years of discrimination and disinvestment exploded in civil unrest and resistance in the wake of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And this unrest in Kansas City was sparked when the Kansas City police used tear gas against student protesters who had gathered and marched due to frustration that the city had not called off school so that they could mourn King's death. The people of Kansas City and of the metropolitan area paid a high price for all of this disinvestment. It's clear that Black and brown residents suffered the most in the most concrete ways, but everyone in the region experienced a disassociation from the city and its long and notable history during this period. These were the years in which many American cities, including Kansas City, were, quote, at war with their own past. So cities, historian Thomas Frank, or really author Thomas Frank argues, quote, have proceeded through the years in a frenzy of building, raising, and reconstruction, continually wrecking and then reconstituting themselves elsewhere, expanding over the surrounding countryside like an ever-spreading infection, he says. Such sprawl that includes the purposeful neglect of the city's downtown core, quote, involves more than just mere physical growth. As the, quote, character and design of the new metropolis takes definition from, quote, the razing of the old and the indiscriminate destruction of obsolete buildings and neighborhoods. So Frank is skeptical of any community that adopts such practices as, quote, the blueprint for civic organization. But he is especially pointed in his criticism of Kansas City, which is his hometown. Kansas City, he notes, has long prioritized blandness and property values over history and the cultivation of a distinctive urban core. Quote, detached from the peculiarities of the time and place, contemporary Kansas City, he concludes, advanced urban renewal projects that deliberately obscured the city's, quote, now vanished cultural inheritance. So Frank's critique is not without standing, and others have made similar points with even more force. Notably, about 30 years ago, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and Kansas City native Richard Rhodes authored a cutting assessment of the city entitled Cupcake Land, which is where I get that title, his term for the rolling, quote, vanilla suburbs of metropolitan Kansas City. The defining feature of the region was, he noted, a desire to disconnect from history. Quote, Kansas City renounced its heritage when it pledged allegiance to Cupcake Land. In the middling decades of the 20th century, city fathers led an effort to obscure the region's Pendergast-era body history. The goal was to attract the kind of investment that could transform a Midwestern cowtown into a, quote, regular American city, which was best accomplished with a strategy of separation and historical denial. So Frank, Rhodes, and others who comment on Kansas City's, quote, every place character make a significant, if still somewhat controversial point. Now, in their defense, their criticism was directed at the city's ever-expanding suburbs. And in the mid to late 20th century, there is little question that Kansas City accelerated its outward reach. When combined with a drop in corporate investment and white flight, as white Kansas Cityans abandoned the urban core for the ever-expanding suburbs, the result was a central city marked as a place of difference and neglect that lasted for many decades. So by 2000, Kansas City was the 11th most racially segregated city in the nation between Black and white residents due to its extreme residential patterns. And if you went downtown in the 1980s and 90s, it was a ghost town after 5 o'clock. No one lived there. The stores had mostly closed, and there was very, very little reason to visit. But all of that has started to change in the last couple of decades. Really, the city and the people of the city have engineered a community revitalization that perhaps ironically takes its cues oftentimes from the exact history now celebrated in parts of the city that were built during the Pendergast era. So sprawl and conformity defined the city in the second half of the 20th century. But in the years between the two world wars, the town was marked by a competitive brand of politics and a vibrant culture, an age that was anything but ordinary. So to travel to any of the revitalized neighborhoods of the city today, the Crossroads Art District, the West Bottoms, the Garment District, the River Market, 18th and Vine, Westport, and the Country Club Plaza, is to see ample evidence of a community that finds contemporary significance in the long tail of this really distinctive history. And importantly, much of the recent focus on urban renewal has centered on the rejuvenation of the neighborhoods and public places that were first promoted by city boosters in the 1920s and 30s. And I think this is actually a fortunate consequence of the long neglect of downtown, because a significant part of this 20th century built environment still stands and can be renovated and revitalized. So developers now use carefully selected elements of history to reimagine many of the city's once overlooked landmarks and neighborhoods. And to be sure, I mean, a lot of this is very commercially driven and entrepreneurial. They're trying to boost tourism and downtown business. That's the primary goal. But still, these places are, they're saving these places, including Union Station and the World War I Memorial, which has been turned into a world-class World War I, the National World War I Museum. Yet, as a new generation of city residents search for meaning beyond suburban cupcake land, they have increasingly embraced the city's spirited past, focusing on the period that they imagine to be their city's golden age, whether, that's questionable, but that's what they imagine. Indeed, in recent decades, Kansas City has turned around. A brief economic boom in the 70s, followed by a more prolonged period of development in the 90s, led to a downtown revitalization and finally a population increase. The city boasts an increasingly diverse population. And although still plagued by racial segregated housing patterns, in the past 2 decades, the city has dropped from 11th to 27th most segregated city in the country, which is still not great, but certainly an improvement. And this is while many of the other cities at the top of the list in 2000 are still at the top of the list. People have moved to Kansas City from throughout the world in recent decades, resulting in an increasingly diverse population in both the city and the suburbs. And Kansas Cityans have moved back downtown. And there are now restaurants and bars and art galleries and stores, and they're scattered throughout the inner core. The metropolitan area is home to numerous Fortune 500 companies and a thriving cultural and recreational scene, including the Truman Library Museum, the National World War I Museum, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, which is an amazing art museum for a city this size, and the 18th Divine Historic District, as well as an opera and a ballet and a symphony. And despite what Frank says, there's now once again a thriving jazz scene in Kansas City. The city is also home of the multiple Super Bowl winning Kansas City Chiefs and even Taylor Swift, at least during football season. So Kansas City is once again a city of national and even international standing, and we are proud to be known as a location on the map and to be in national conversations in recent years, something that Kansas City boosters have long desired. The city has recently made lists of top 10 places to visit, and the World Cup is coming next year. And throughout the city, you see residents wearing clothing that demonstrates their love for the city and their teams. And if you are flying into Kansas City and you go to a Kansas City gate in any place in this country, you will see people wearing Kansas City gear. It's really remarkable. That would not have been the case 25 years ago when I moved back home. Now, this is not to say that things are perfect. The city still has a high level of crime. The Kansas City public schools are still highly segregated due to these housing patterns. And there is still little investment in the east side. And of course, gentrification is a concern in many urban neighborhoods. But despite these challenges, I think most residents would agree that we are moving forward rather than moving backward. So with its heartland location, its mild manners, and expansive suburbs, Kansas City has long been stigmatized as generic, quote, flyover country. But I hope this talk has shown you that looking beneath the surface of the city's history reveals a much more complex and captivating story about American economic development, race relations, politics, and cultural transformation. So in an inversion of the every place neighborhood, I would argue that indeed Kansas City and the greater region is at the crossroads of the nation and its history. This place is a microcosm of America, exemplifying both the positive and the negative aspects of our greater history. All right, and I'll leave you with a picture of Pat winning the Super Bowl for the first time. All right, so any other questions? And I've got all the time.
Good deal. That is our time. Everyone, thank you so much. It has been an evening. Diane, just thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule for this comprehensive, this robust, this illuminating overview of Kansas and its significance as a microcosm of America. All of our teachers, everyone who's here tonight, everyone's extremely appreciative in the chat. And I also just extend my thanks to Matt as well as Elizabeth, who were active in the chat. And Diane, I don't know that I mentioned this, but they're both from the region. They're literature and history teachers who are, deeply committed to their communities, and so they shared resources throughout the evening. Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you all for joining us for this series. This is we're celebrating a decade, so this is our 10th season, and in the fall we will return for our 11th season. So we will begin in September with another round of webinars. And again, many of the topics you all have informed our decision to host sessions based on those topics as well. But I especially enjoyed this evening, particularly because in about 3.5 weeks, I will be flying into MCI. Yeah, we will be out. Actually, we will be in Lawrence, Kansas for the Artificial Intelligence and Digital Literacy Institute. So yeah, I'm flying in and I'm looking forward to it. And I will actually I'll replay this webinar and listen, particularly as I check out the downtown sites and sounds.
Well, hopefully it will prepare you for your trip. So thanks, and thanks to Elizabeth and Matt for managing the chat today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And the National Humanities Center in the coming year will be pretty active out there in the Kansas City area, particularly next summer. So I look forward to seeing you when I'm out there. So again, everyone, thank you for joining us this evening. When you get the opportunity, please check us out at nationalhumanitiescenter.org on all of our social media feeds. To stay updated on all that's happening at the center, as I mentioned earlier, we have our featured activities and events that are listed on our main page. So I encourage you all to go there, check us out. In addition, NHC education programs, we provide a bridge between the academic world and the working classroom. Your gift, no matter how modest, can open up a world of ideas for teachers and rekindle their enthusiasm for the subjects they teach by providing the knowledge and tools that they and their students need to make a difference. So, as I mentioned before, we are a private nonprofit, and we appreciate any and all contributions. So, thank you so much. Again, thank you for participating in the Humanities in Class webinar series 24-25. The 25-26 webinar series will begin in the fall. For our 11th season, registration will open August 15th, 2025. If I can assist in any way, answer any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me at mwilliams@nationalhumanitiescenter.org. It's been a great year, and continue to do the great things that you all are doing. I pray that you all have a restful and restorative summer break. Take care and be well.